I call Kevin Haig.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. David Bennett, in his contribution to this debate, referred to this bill as a small bill, and I think that was generous on his behalf. As officials pointed out to the Select Committee, in fact, this bill achieves almost nothing. Nonetheless, the small amount that it does contribute possibly is worth supporting, and we will vote for it in the second reading debate. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister last week said that there was no housing crisis. And Mr. Speaker, it feels very much like it is a housing crisis to those people who are increasingly shut out of home ownership. New Zealand has the lowest rate of home ownership that we have experienced since 1951. The lowest rate since 1951. And why is that a problem, Mr. Speaker? It's a problem because New Zealand made a choice, and countries generally made a policy choice between comprehensive superannuation programs or alternatively policies that supported comprehensive home ownership. And New Zealand chose the latter of those. Our policy settings were designed to encourage almost universal home ownership because we weren't going to provide comprehensive superannuation. And so when we have our rates of near universal home ownership from the past actually declining to their lowest rate since 1951, that is a crisis. And it's a crisis because more and more New Zealanders are shut out. We have particularly declining rates of home ownership amongst Māori and Pacifica New Zealanders, and indeed from the increasing group of poor New Zealanders who are likely to see that they will never have the opportunity to own a home in their lifetime. And that's a problem, sir, not only for them, it's a problem for all of us, as increasing inequality has been shown to be. That inequality is not only a problem for those at the bottom of the heap, but for the whole society. The whole society carries the costs of increasing inequality, sir. And the consequence of that decreasing rate of home ownership is to throw more and more people on the mercy of the appalling rental market in New Zealand. That delivers extremely poor quality housing in general, that delivers a very poor standard of rental security, that still exposes New Zealanders to increasing rental costs, increasing right now at a 6.5% increase year on year. And as I say, sir, those major consequences down the track for our retirement savings and incomes for New Zealanders. So the problem is not just theirs, it's also ours. This is, Mr. Speaker, particularly a problem for young people, which is where this bill comes in. And I speaking in the House last week, pointed out that for New Zealanders aged from 20 to 39, so a group of New Zealanders that we would expect to be moving into home ownership, establishing families, and setting the foundation for their productive years as adults and for their retirement savings and incomes. For that age group, for New Zealanders aged 20 to 39, home ownership declined from 61.4% in the 1986 census to 26.8% in 2013. It more than halved. We have a plummeting rate of home ownership by younger New Zealanders. And that's 20 to 39, sir. It's not only the very young New Zealanders who may only just be moving into the age where we expect home ownership to be occurring. It's for that whole group. And for New Zealanders aged 20 to 34, in the Auckland region, ownership had declined in 2013 to 17.2%. Now, and Mr. Speaker, it's not much better in other large cities. So young people, I'm sure, will have been thrilled to hear the government or the National Party in its election campaign just weeks before the general election last year, talking in terms of providing a handout or a hand up for those young New Zealanders, and talking about how they understood the plight that young New Zealanders faced in trying to afford their own home. It seemed like we had a national party that cared about the plight of young New Zealanders. However, Mr. Speaker, I suspect that not many of those young New Zealanders looked at the detail of the policy that National was offering them. And those young New Zealanders that Nick Smith referred to in his contribution earlier in this debate, that said that they really welcomed what the government was doing, I don't imagine that they had looked at the numbers, and I don't imagine that Nick Smith pointed out what those numbers are to those young New Zealanders. Because the total contribution that this makes, sir, is, let's see, $521 per person per year. And even that contribution, Mr. Speaker, will be at the expense of the person's own retirement savings. This contrasts, Mr. Speaker, with a median house price in Auckland just now of $621,800, while the average median household income for New Zealanders aged between 20 and 34 is just $48,600. That $521 per person per year will go almost nowhere to adding to the affordability of housing for that group of young New Zealanders. Stephen Joyce in the House last week said he couldn't understand why it was relevant to compare median house prices with the median household incomes of young New Zealanders. But I can assure Mr. Joyce that those young people understand. The overlap between their incomes and house prices is becoming smaller and smaller. They are drifting further and further apart. Home ownership is becoming an unaffordable dream for more and more young people in this country. And this bill, sir, does almost nothing to fix that problem. And that group of young people is the same group that's also saddled with high rates of unemployment, that's saddled very often with high and unaffordable student debt. They are facing a situation where their own health and welfare is being put at risk by that financial situation, by the unaffordability of both buying houses and renting houses, but also, sir, this intergenerational inequity that the government is feeding by its policies across the board affects those people not only now, but it also affects them in the future when they come to retire, and it affects the situation that their children will inherit. There is a structural inequality that the government is building into the New Zealand economy that will saddle this country with debt and with deep and deeper problems for generations to come. Against that picture, sir, what this bill does is essentially nothing. It is a demand-side stimulant at a time when what we need to do is to deflate the speculative market in housing, increase supply, and reduce demand. What instead the government needs to do is to tackle the root causes of the problem. And sir, we would suggest a 5-point plan, a capital gains tax, restriction on home and land ownership by non-resident foreign citizens, accelerated intensification of building housing, particularly around Auckland's public transport corridors, a regional development strategy to divert demand away to places which are supply-rich in housing but currently job-poor, and potentially, sir, different macroprudential tools targeting the mark-to-market nature of valuation and its relationship to lending. That would be a package of measures that might actually start to address that problem. There's nothing offensive enough about this bill to require us to vote against it, sir. But what is offensive and deeply disappointing is a government whose housing program is based on unfettered ideology and a government who seems to be bereft of ideas when it comes to actually ensuring that everybody in New Zealand is well housed. Thank you, sir.